today we're going to talk about interest rate swaps. So maybe let's start by asking the question to the audience. Who doesn't know what interest rate swaps are about? Okay, cool. So maybe I'll do a quick introduction with a very simple use case, then we go directly to the panelists. So imagine you have a mortgage with a variable rate, and basically the bank gets a variable rate from a central bank. And if you want a fixed rate, the bank is going to do what we call an interest rate swap to exchange a variable rate against a fixed rate. And then they add a percentage on top of that and they give it to you. Okay. So here we're exchanging a variable against a fixed. You can also do the opposite. You could exchange a fixed against a variable. You happy with the definition?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So my name is Kamel. I'm going to moderate this session. We have Simon and Darren. I would like to introduce yourself.
Sure. So I'm Simon. I am the CEO and co-founder of Vault Labs. And as you might have guessed, we've built an interest rate swap AMM. And to explain that at a very, very macro level, just to build on that, if we actually go back to why on earth did we even start Vaults in the first place, really as a team, we kind of hold as our North Star an ambition to help DeFi become the financial system for the whole of the world. And in doing so, we frankly want that to change the lives of billions of people. But there's a really big problem that we identified, which is that DeFi as an ecosystem is extremely variable and volatile. So if we actually want to be able to serve the financial needs of the world, clearly there needs to be a mechanism that enables that to not exist, if that makes sense. And at the most macro level, what an interest rate swap enables is it enables you to move from something that is variable and therefore volatile to something that is fixed and therefore stable, and enables stability to exist through the ecosystem for those that want it. And in doing so, frankly, massively expands the types of products that we can build in this space such that DeFi can start serving the financial needs of the world.
Hi, I'm Darren. I'm the CEO of iPoor Labs. We're also looking at this from we take a couple of different TradFi fundamentals. So I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the LIBOR, London Interbank Offered Rate. And then we build interest rate derivatives, peer-to-pool model. And I mean, kind of going off of what you guys were saying, like Kamel, you were talking about some of the uses, right? So if you're a retail user, right, and you used Aave, you use Compound, whether you're a borrower or a lender, you have some exposure to the rates, right? So if rate rises, if you're a borrower, it's bad because you have to pay more. If you're a lender, it's great because you make more. But it's really about capping your exposure, right? The thing is, like, not many retail know about this because interest rate swaps and interest rate derivatives in general are largely inaccessible. It's usually bank to bank. It's very large instruments, right? But one thing that's really cool about decentralized finance is it breaks down the barriers. So, for example, you can use Volts, you can use iPoor to hedge your interest rate risk. And this may not sound exciting, but this is, this is a hundreds of trillions of dollars notional market in traditional finance. It's the underpinning of the global debt markets. So, it's not a very well-known, let's say, instrument by retail finance, but it's one of the most traded instruments in the world. And, we're bringing that to decentralized finance.
Great. It's quite exciting to have you both on stage today because in Ethereum ecosystem, indeed, we only have two IRS protocols at the moment. Correct me if I'm wrong. No? So the two of them are here. And as far as we know, this doesn't exist in any other ecosystem. So it's really something nascent. I believe you both went live this year also. Okay, great. And you have two different mechanisms. So mainly you're following one type of instrument for Vaults. You are using an index. It would be interesting to explain a bit more to the public how this works. Simon, maybe first?
Sure. So maybe if we go back to some of the use cases that Darren was talking about for an interest rate swap, it kind of very broadly breaks down into three different buckets. There's one which is speculation, so you could speculate on the direction of rates are going to move, and when you're doing that with leverage, there's actually potential to generate some pretty significant returns. The second is risk management, which is what Darren was talking to. So, for example, if you've got a borrowing cost, you're exposed to that spiking massively. You don't want to be exposed to that, so you can hedge away that risk and have a fixed borrowing cost instead. And then the third is product construction. And that in traditional finance basically involves creating lots of different structured products for corporates. But then from a retail perspective, it includes things like fixed rate mortgages. So if you go to somebody on the street and say, do you know what an interest rate swap is? They'll say no. But if you say, do you know what a fixed rate mortgage is? They'll say, well, of course. And what's actually happening in the background is that's being constructed off the back of this very low level capital markets infrastructure that is an interest rate swap. So when we're thinking about vaults and thinking about like what is it that we're trying to solve for in the mechanism design, we're really thinking very carefully about two things. One, making it as composable as possible such that it can enable all of these new products to be built. And then the other is to make it as capital efficient as possible, such that you can trade with leverage, which means obviously from the speculative use case, it becomes attractive. But it also means that if you are hedging risk, you're only having to deposit a small amount of margin in order to hedge a large amount of notional. So it makes it kind of a lot more capital efficient. So in order to do that, on the first, from the composability perspective, we made a bunch of design decisions that enabled the protocol and every part of the protocol to exist fully on-chain. So there's absolutely nothing, not even a rate oracle that exists off-chain. It's all on-chain, which enables the products to start being built right in the same way that they exist in traditional finance, and arguably, like and we're seeing this already. There's the potential for even more innovation because anybody can come in and build on top of this primitive. On the other point around capital efficiency, if you think about like Uniswap as an AMM, the AMM itself performs two functions. It defines the relationship between one asset to another, which therefore defines the price, right? And then the other thing that it does is it actually holds all of the assets. So your total market size in terms of what can be traded is the total amount of assets that are deposited into that AMM, which means that you don't have leverage. So what we did is we split the AMM into two separate modules. One which is described as the virtual automated market maker, and the other which we describe as the margin engine. And the way that this works is when you come in as a trader, you choose the amount of notional that you basically want to trade, and the margin engine computes the amount of margin that you need to deposit in order to collateralize that trade. And what that then does is it mints virtual fixed and variable tokens that go into the AMM, such that the AMM now is just performing one function, which is the pricing oracle, whilst the margin engine is actually holding all of the assets. And that split is really important because that is what has enabled leverage to exist in the ecosystem.
Okay, cool. So I think, IPOR, we really started with an index construction. So if you guys have heard of the LIBOR London Interbank Offered Rate, or you have other benchmark rates, this is a mechanism that underpins, like for example, if you get that mortgage, typically it's quoted off a benchmark rate plus some percentage spread. So you might take a home loan right now at the SOFR plus 3%. For example. So this benchmark rate is really, think of it as like a thermometer or barometer. It's not really setting the rate dynamic. It's actually reading what the rate dynamic is. So in the LIBOR sense, you have a set of banks that report the rate they report the rate. You take the top, you take the outliers out, and then you volume weight it, right? And this becomes the benchmark of hundreds of trillions of dollars in debt deals, derivatives. It's great, but the problem actually was with the LIBOR, it was formerly called the world's most important number because it has so many instruments pegged to it. And it really got discontinued at the end of last year. But actually, this discontinuation is extending. So, LIBOR is getting a little encore performance because you had all of these assets that were really pegged to it for, very long dated instruments. And really, these instruments are moving to another benchmark rate, which is the SOFR, which is really taking up, the place. But this whole idea of an on-chain interest rate benchmark is something that in the decentralized world we can have a much better dynamic. And instead of financial institutions, what was happening with financial institutions is bankers were literally texting each other on Facebook Messenger and saying, "Hey, can you just under or over report, just shave a little 1 basis point off from me?" The traders were taking the opposite side of that. They were potentially pocketing up to a couple $1 million per trade, and this is problematic, right? But in this decentralized finance world, we have some things that are on chain, they're auditable, they're always reconcilable, and so we create this dynamic where it just it's a survey of smart contracts. And to manipulate the smart contracts, you have to take a market action, which, from my perspective, is not manipulation. This is a market action. So we get this better dynamic for a benchmark interest rate, and that interest rate, it follows the market, right? So there's a lot of fixed income protocols that are really trying to predict, what will the rate be in the future. And, if we look at what the rate dynamics are right now in DeFi, you're talking about, 2 to 3% across USDC, and DAI. If we looked about maybe a year and a half ago, you could predictably get 10% on your stablecoins. So because we don't have really this yield curve in DeFi, if you predict too far in the future, you're bound to be wrong. Why? Because these instruments, they're highly liquid, but the rate dynamics are very hard to predict, right? And so this is why you might use an interest rate derivative to hedge your future rate risk, because you don't know where it's going. On the other side, so I think you're doing more like individual markets. So if you're an actor on this particular market, you can hedge against this particular rate dynamic. In the IPOR sense, you're hedging against the macro. So the macro dynamic, whether the rates are going to go up or down, across this benchmark rate. And then from the pool construction side, the pool essentially underwrites these instruments. So we focused on aggregated liquidity because that was one of the issues that a lot of kind of the early pioneers in the fixed income or even the coupon space faced inside of DeFi. So maybe I can go into that later.
Super interesting that you're talking about indexes versus one instrument, and you used the argument of price manipulation protection by using an index. So maybe Simon, you can tell us a bit more about how Volts is protecting itself from market manipulation by using only one market.
Yeah, so the way that so we have on-chain rate oracles. So maybe to add some context, so we've got a bunch of different pools that are available to trade on Volt's protocol. If I just choose one as an example, let's take ST-ETH, right? So Lido staked ETH. That generates a yield, and what we do is we pool that yield that's being generated and updated. It kind of varies by protocol, but just assume it's block by block, right? It's changing block by block. We pull that variable rate into the ecosystem and then create a market off the back of that. And the way in which that kind of rate gets pulled in is we have what we describe as an on-chain rate oracle that reads the rate, and then every time someone trades, that rate is basically pulled in and updated in the ecosystem. Which it follows like a mechanism design comparable to Uniswap's TWAP, which basically protects it against what's described as rate oracle manipulation, where someone would go and do like a massive trade, for example, on ST-ETH, try and affect the rate, do a trade on Volt, and then unwind their trade on ST-ETH, at which point you could theoretically affect it. But the TWAP mechanism like prevents against that, and that's what we built into the protocol.
Nice. Maybe let's touch a little bit the AMM construction. So maybe Darren explain us what kind of model you use there to fix the rate? And maybe Simon, after it would be nice if you can explain to the audience how you came to use Uni V3 and what kind of deal you did with them.
Oh, okay. So, even from what Simon described, it's much more market driven, and then on the IPO side, it's much more model driven. So we have a quite a deep quant experience on our team. We have two guys coming with over 20 years in traditional finance. We actually have one Brazilian living in Tokyo who's he's the chief scientist. And we had another Brazilian who was one of the top Brazilian debt analysts in the world who was helping, at a very, very early stage of the protocol. And why I mention that is when you're in emerging markets, you have high volatility, right? So we went into the quant toolkit and picked out different models that are very good at high volatility. So one of them is called jump diffusion. And it's the idea that, these rates spike up and then you'll have this time decay and the rates will go back down, and essentially modeling out it's somewhat predictive analytics of the probability of something this to happen. So we borrowed something from a very interesting toolkit, and really the construction that you do on chain, when you're a quant, you can control any of the dynamics that you can in a spreadsheet, right? But when you're building something on chain, you have to have this interplay between the complexity, the risk management, and the gas cost. And so it's really turning all of these quant models into something that's good enough approximation of risk on chain that's actually reasonably cost efficient to run. So we combine actually three models. So one is whole white, which is the traditional interest rate model. Two is jump diffusion, which is this trending upside volatility but reversion to the mean rate. And the third is Longstaff-Schwartz, which is actually pricing for optionality. So the IPOR instruments are cancelable. They're cancelable swaps because we wanted to design something that really fits the temperament of the Aave and compound users, which is, let's say, very finicky. You put in, you can take out at any time. And we really needed to design an instrument that matches, let's say, this lack of structure, at least at the beginning, to bootstrap the market. And then looking at the longer dated instruments, there will probably be a change in that dynamic. The other side is it's an aggregated model. So for example, there's one market each for USDC, DAI, and USDT. So for example, what an aggregated model means is that there's a single depositor, so a single liquidity pool that underwrites all of the instruments in this pool. So that means you always have this aggregated liquidity that's available for the trader to take a position against. So the trader can take a position against the pool if they accept the quote by the AMM, which is built on those models that I just mentioned. The clock starts at the time that they take it, and it matures 28 days later, and it can be canceled. So this is more of like a request for quote system. So it's maybe a more flexible framework. It's much more difficult to model out in terms of risk. But again, for the dynamic, we try to build something that matches the temperament of the actual actors on Aave compound.
Yeah. So the question was around the use of Uniswap's concentrated liquidity in vaults, right?
Yes. What kind of AMM you use? Like, for example,
yeah,
is a very specific system that they built, and you leverage DeFi with another.
Yeah. So we, I won't go back into explaining the virtual automated market maker from Margin Engine, but for people deep enough in the ecosystem, Uniswap launched V3 of the protocol, like 18 months ago or something. And within that, they introduced a concept described as concentrated liquidity, which basically enables you as a liquidity provider to choose the price ranges within which you want your liquidity to exist for people to trade against. And it's a pretty cool mechanic, I've got to be honest. It kind of massively increases capital efficiency. But one of the things that they introduced at that time too was basically a bunch of legal protections that existed on top of Uniswap v3 as a protocol. So you couldn't just fork it. Which for them, they were obviously doing after what happened with SushiSwap. But within that, there was a mechanism that allows the Uniswap DAO to grant other teams the ability to use parts or all of the code. And it's a bit of DeFi trivia for everyone there. So we, as a team, we really liked this mechanic. We wanted to exist in vaults. So it was the first ever DAO to DAO deal between two DAOs, where the Vaults DAO granted Uniswap 1% of Vaults' future tokens in exchange for being allowed to use parts of the code in the Vault's code base. So it's about 5% of all of like the Vault's smart contracts, which is actually lifted directly from Uniswap, and that enables this concentrated liquidity mechanic to exist in the protocol.
Amazing. We have 1 minute and a half left, so I'm going to open the mic for some questions.
You actually have more time. That's just, you'll have 5 more minutes for questions.
Okay, great. So maybe I will finish this by asking you, what is the killer feature or killer use of your protocol, generating APY or hedging or whatever you could have in mind?
Well, so I think it comes back to those three use cases. There's still speculation, risk management, product construction. Within DeFi, like specifically, the product construction is a really exciting part. The fact that anybody can come in and build on top of the protocol. And we launched 5 months ago, been growing about 30% a week since, which is honestly is amazing growth. But that's predominantly at the moment driven off speculation and risk management, which is inevitable because it's a new primitive for DeFi. Teams have to get familiar with it and then start building on top of it. But we had the first team go live 2 weeks ago who launched something on top of the protocol. And there's a whole bunch of teams who are kind of talking to us or actively building new things that will kind of take advantage of this new market that exists in DeFi. And that is one, I think, or likely to be the predominant driver of growth, kind of specifically from a DeFi perspective going forward.
Yeah, maybe I'll touch on something like very DeFi native. So the instrument itself, the interest rate swaps live on IPOR. These will extend the durations. We're looking at right now a design of an interest rate futures market, and it's essentially a derivatives DEX, right? So it offers all of the opportunities to hedge, to speculate, to arbitrage. But maybe the interesting thing, like from a DeFi native perspective, is the IPOR DAO for the actual interest rate benchmark rate, right? So this is nice because we're looking at, like, in the case of the LIBOR where you had this inside manipulation, you also get a funny dynamic in DeFi, which is not present in traditional finance, right? The banks, the London banks that are, you know, reporting to the LIBOR, they're not going to change much over time. But in the DeFi scenario, we actually have protocols come up, protocols come down, protocols get hacked all the time, right? So this dynamic of who's leading in the market is always changing. So it'll be very interesting, you know, which protocols are ingested into the, you know, as rate reporters into the IPOR in the future, which protocols are taken out. For example, how do you remove a protocol in case of manipulation? How do you take data now from, you know, another chain? Right now, the IPOR protocol is Aave and Compound on Ethereum, but what happens when you're going to Avalanche or, you know, another protocol? So this is all some very interesting things that we actually don't have answers to yet, and these dynamics, they'll develop over time, but it's a perfect case for decentralized governance. So there's very clear, let's say, mechanisms, so there will be some tokenomics around the use of the derivative instrument itself, but I mean, how do you qualify or quantify the opportunity of you know, holding governance over this this benchmark rate, which could be, you know, the base of structuring of, if we can recreate these hundreds of trillions of dollars in deals, derivatives, and debt, you know, what's the future value of that? I don't know, but I think that's a very interesting kind of very native DeFi element that will be very powerful in the future.
Nice. Any questions?
Hi, thanks. I'm actually a big fan of both IPOR and Volt. And I'm also a fan of these new designs and net new primitives in DeFi in general. That's why I've been tracking. I found one thing, Simon, that you mentioned that's super interesting and wanted to see if you had any other ideas on that respect, which is you mentioning that Uniswap or other DEXs basically have the two functions in the same product, right? Where they're both holding the tokens there and also pricing the relative value between those two tokens. And that if you go synthetic, which is your case, where you're not actually holding those positions, you can just get much higher leverage by doing that in a synthetic way, right? I'm wondering if you see other opportunities to do that kind of separation that you mentioned for other types of financial products on chain, like be it other derivatives or other types of products to basically be able to leverage that much more than just having the spot.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think the short answer to that is yes. So there's within those teams that have reached out to us to start building on top of the protocol, like leveraging this new fixed income market. There's actually also teams who've reached out to us asking us to create markets, right, such that new derivative markets could exist, which still leverages that underlying infrastructure of margin engine separate from virtual automated market maker.
Is there a specific one, like other than interest rate swaps, like another
Yeah.
expansion that you're thinking?
So one of the things that's really interesting within the Vault's AMM today is with rates can't go negative, which means if you're thinking about like the price of an asset, right, the price of an asset can go up or it can go down, whereas a rate always has a lower bound, which is zero. So there are people that have reached out wanting to do like derivatives on the price of an asset and building products that exist on top of that type of market. For us to enable that, we need to make some small changes to the AMM in order for it to be able to support effectively negative rates, but in this instance, it's just the price going lower.
Totally. Thank you.
Yeah, I was wondering with regards to hedging the real RMBS or mortgage-backed securities, so it doesn't have to be RMBS. Have any of you guys thought of futures for, say, a 30-year mortgage, a company that's or someone that's taking risk on a third, which is a long-term mortgage, or 10-year, et cetera? Because I believe those products don't exist in the real world, and the DeFi ecosystem seems to be enamored with bringing real-world assets on chain, and I think it's going to happen eventually. And you also have a lot of protocols like Maple and a few others that are already digging their feet in. Is there any enthusiasm to have a future contract for that to protect for those folks who are taking that risk on chain?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's I mean kind of two different cases there, right? So as Simon mentioned, you had the baby that was a big fan of everything on chain. Whatever you can do on chain, like we're focusing on really underpinning the DeFi credit markets, right? So that's something really native to DeFi. And if you're talking about, the 30-year mortgage-backed securities, right? You have to have a price input and you have to create a new model. You have to have an underwriter for that risk, or you're creating an order book on chain, right? So it's an interesting thing, but what I'm more interested in the IPOR case is actually building out the yield curve in DeFi natively, so that in DeFi you'll be able to do this home loan on chain. So if we go back to the issue, we can't predict what this debt is worth tomorrow in DeFi, and this is a problem. And for example, with the IPOR rates, we effectively have spot rates. Eventually we'll get to the IPOR 1 month USDT rate, IPOR 3 month, for example. But we have to really go 1 month at a time because we don't have any market maturity. So we're really focused DeFi native. But for example, you could do this. You could bring in a rate oracle. You would have to basically have someone underwrite the risk. I mean, that's the big thing in this market. But I think it's quite interesting because it's taking a real world asset, it's taking a more mature market and bringing it on chain. But we're focusing on like specifically DeFi credit market so that we can offer this home loan, on from a decentralized bank.
Super cool. And the Oracle portion of it, do you outsource that or you build it in-house?
It was built in-house, but the thing is the Oracle is printed on chain, right? So it's a public good. So anyone who wants to peg an asset to the Oracle, they just read the contract. So like if we talk about what's the future value of the IPO rates, you have this historical chain of on-chain rates. And any external contract can read that. They can use it for pricing of different mechanisms. So it's a public good. I mean, this is so maybe the future value of the IPO will be, let's say, let's talk about the value, volume, and velocity of external contract calls.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. I believe we have to feed the space. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Darren. I hope you enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.